Inside Vatican City, the pressure is no longer hidden behind closed doors. Three of the most powerful cardinals in the Catholic Church are reportedly facing imminent canonical action, while documents have been secured and the phones of at least two senior figures have been requested for forensic review. No formal arrest has been confirmed, but according to a source who worked within the Vatican administrative structure for more than 2 decades, the process has already crossed the point where it can be quietly reversed. The order reportedly came from Pope Leo XIV himself. Less than 13 months after Robert Francis Prevost entered the Apostolic Palace as Pope, he has allowed an investigation to move against men with allies, institutional reach, and histories tied to powerful interests inside and outside the Church. This is not a conflict over doctrine, liturgy, or competing theological factions. It is a confrontation over financial records, alleged obstruction, and a network that the source claims survived beneath several previous administrations. During the first days of May in 2026, the atmosphere inside Vatican City reportedly changed. Conversations stopped when certain officials entered rooms, requests for clarification moved through internal channels, and a silence settled over corridors that had remained calm only weeks earlier. The three cardinals had believed that the Pope would eventually negotiate, protect their dignity, or allow the matter to disappear through the usual institutional channels. According to the insider, they had misread him completely. What began within 48 hours of the conclave as a quiet request for 7 years of raw financial records would eventually lead to a hidden commission, discrepancies across 3 funds, an alleged attempt to pressure an external auditor, and contact between Vatican and Italian judicial authorities. Every stage was reportedly documented. Every procedural step was designed to prevent the investigation from being dismissed as retaliation or political theater. By the time the cardinals understood the full structure surrounding them, the conversation may already have been over. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications as this investigation continues to develop. The story ahead will follow the sequence from the first financial request after the election to the decisions that placed 3 senior cardinals under direct scrutiny. The most dangerous part is not that 3 men may fall. It is that the source insists they are only the first layer. The sequence began on May 8, 2025, when Robert Francis Prevost was elected Pope Leo XIV. The conclave had ended, the ceremonial transition had begun, and the Vatican bureaucracy expected the familiar rhythm of introductions, formal handovers, and carefully prepared briefings. Within 48 hours, that expectation was broken. The new pope reportedly asked for 7 years of raw financial records. He did not request summaries, executive reports, or documents selected in advance by department heads. According to the insider, he wanted the underlying records themselves, including the material that had not yet been arranged for presentation. The request moved quietly through a personal aide instead of the ordinary official channels. That decision limited the number of people who knew what he was seeking and prevented the request from being shaped before it reached the relevant offices. The first response was delay. Administrators explained that the correct files were spread across several dicasteries and would require time to assemble. They said the records were complex, the reporting structures were separate, and the documents could not be produced immediately. Nothing in the explanation openly refused the Pope, but nothing placed the requested material on his desk. For 2 weeks, Pope Leo XIV did not escalate the matter. He allowed the departments time to respond and gave no public sign of frustration. The source describes him as watching the process rather than intervening in it, allowing each delay and explanation to become part of the record. The silence was not approval. It was the first test of how the system would behave when asked to expose itself. After 2 weeks, the Pope asked again. This time, the request did not travel informally through a personal aide. It moved through official channels, carried institutional authority, and included a deadline that could no longer be treated as a suggestion. According to the insider, the effect was immediate inside a specific cluster of Vatican administrators. Conversations became more guarded, explanations changed, and allies within the College of Cardinals were drawn into the response. The source describes visible panic, not across the entire Vatican, but among the people who understood what 7 years of unfiltered records could reveal. At least 3 cardinals allegedly began coordinating their next move. Their response was not described as cooperation, it was described as an effort to block, delay, and redirect the review without appearing to defy the Pope openly. Documents could be produced slowly, routed through additional offices, or separated from the records that gave them context. The purpose, according to the insider, was to control what reached the Apostolic Palace and when it arrived. The source goes further and alleges that some financial documentation was not merely delayed, but altered. It presents this as part of an established method that had been used before whenever scrutiny moved too close to the same network. Under previous administrations, the strategy had allegedly relied on institutional patience, divided authority, and the expectation that confrontation would eventually become too expensive. The 3 cardinals believed that the same calculation would protect them again. What they did not yet understand was that the Pope was no longer waiting for the bureaucracy to explain itself. The deadline had transformed a quiet request into a measurable act of resistance. Every missing record, changed explanation, and delayed response now carried a different meaning. The financial review had begun to reveal not only what the documents contained, but who was determined to keep them from being seen. By the time the investigation moved beyond the first document requests, the case had narrowed around 3 senior cardinals. The source does not name them, and it does not claim that formal detention has already occurred. It describes them instead through the roles they allegedly played inside a financial structure that crossed offices, jurisdictions, and ideological lines. The first is described as a European cardinal who held a senior financial oversight position under more than one pope. According to the insider, he used that authority to facilitate the movement of funds through accounts that did not appear in official Vatican balance sheets. His importance came not only from access to financial systems, but from the trust attached to an office designed to supervise those systems. The second is identified as a cardinal from Latin America who allegedly connected the internal network to outside real estate arrangements. The Vatican had officially withdrawn from some of those investment structures years earlier, but the source claims the separation was incomplete. His role was reportedly to maintain the connection between Vatican funds and external entities that remained active beyond the public record. The third is described as a cardinal based in Rome who functioned as the internal enforcer. According to the source, he was responsible for preventing inconvenient documents from reaching senior desks and for controlling the consequences faced by officials who asked persistent questions. Some were reassigned, others were sidelined, and the message was delivered without the need for public confrontation. Together, the 3 men allegedly formed different parts of the same mechanism. One controlled financial access, one connected the network to external structures, and one protected it from internal scrutiny. Their backgrounds and theological positions were not the source of their alliance. What united them was the practical value each brought to a system that could not have survived through one office alone. The investigation described in the article had therefore moved past the question of isolated irregularities. It was examining whether authority had been used deliberately to conceal transactions, redirect oversight, and punish resistance. That distinction mattered because it placed senior ecclesiastical power inside the evidentiary chain. The case was no longer only about money. It was about how the institution had been made to protect the movement of that money. A network of that scale could not operate through private loyalty alone. It required a legal and administrative environment in which information could be restricted, careers could be controlled, and most disputes could be resolved without outside examination. The source presents Vatican sovereignty not as the cause of the alleged misconduct, but as one of the conditions that allowed it to remain contained. Vatican City-State operates under its own legal system. Its financial disclosures had improved during the previous decade, but the source emphasizes that they were still not exposed to the same external auditing obligations imposed on public corporations or national treasuries. That difference created space between what internal offices knew and what outside authorities could independently verify. The more powerful protection came from culture, loyalty, discretion, and the expectation that problems should be handled internally were not treated as optional habits. According to the insider, those principles were enforced through appointments, access, and the quiet management of careers. Officials who pushed too hard did not always face open punishment. A meeting disappeared from a calendar, a transfer arrived without explanation, or a promising assignment moved to someone else. The system did not need dramatic threats because every experienced administrator understood what institutional isolation looked like. That environment also made resistance appear reasonable to those inside it. A delayed file could be defended as procedure, a reassignment could be described as ordinary administration, and a missing document could be blamed on the complexity of several dicasteries. Each act remained small enough to deny, even when the combined effect protected the same network. Pope Leo XIV entered that structure without depending on it in the same way. The source argues that his distance from the Roman financial hierarchy made him difficult to pressure through the usual channels. The men under investigation had spent years learning how authority inside the Vatican could be slowed. They were now facing a pope who had begun to use that same authority against the system that once protected them. Robert Francis Prevost had spent years inside the church without becoming dependent on the financial structure, now under scrutiny. His path had moved through Chicago, Peru, leadership within the Augustinian order, Rome, and finally the dicastery for bishops. He understood institutional pressure, but the source argues that he did not owe his position to the network that had learned how to control it. That independence was not presented as an accident. After years of financial scandal, disputed investments, and damaging real estate deals, part of the College of Cardinals reportedly wanted a candidate who stood outside the Roman Curia's entrenched alliances. Prevost fit that requirement because he had worked within the system without being fully absorbed by the interests operating beneath its official hierarchy. The three cardinals allegedly recognized the danger from the beginning. They knew that the new pope had no reason to protect the arrangements that had benefited them, and they understood what his election could mean for the network. Even so, they chose to manage the situation rather than cooperate with it. Their calculation depended on experience. They had seen previous investigations lose momentum, watched internal resistance increase the political cost of reform, and learned that even a pope could be persuaded to accept a negotiated retreat. They expected time, hierarchy, and institutional caution to weaken his resolve. The public image of Pope Leo XIV reinforced that assumption. He appeared warm, pastoral, multilingual, and intellectually restrained. To those who believed authority had to announce itself through anger, his calmness looked like flexibility. The source describes another side of him. Prevost had spent years managing conflict inside a religious order and confronting difficult institutional situations in Peru, Rome, and Chicago. He did not raise his voice, issue theatrical threats, or display public anger. But once he reached a decision, he reportedly stopped moving toward compromise. People who had worked closely with him used a simple phrase to describe that quality. They said he was very still. The words referred not to hesitation, but to the moment when discussion had ended and the decision had already become fixed. According to the insider, the three cardinals understood that distinction only in April of 2026. By then, the original delays had become evidence. The commission had already been operating, and the investigation had moved beyond their ability to redirect it. They had not mistaken his intentions. They had mistaken the kind of authority he was prepared to use. After the first document requests were delayed and partially obstructed during the summer of 2025, Pope Leo XIV made a more consequential move. Between September of 2025 and February of 2026, he established what Vatican officials reportedly called a Transparency Commission. It was small, personally selected, and granted authority to examine financial records across every dicastery. The group included financial auditors and canon lawyers, with several members drawn from outside Vatican City. Their presence reduced the ability of internal offices to control the review through familiar relationships. The commission did not depend on summaries prepared by the departments it was examining. Its composition remained undisclosed for nearly 6 weeks. By the time the three cardinals allegedly learned that the commission existed, it had already been operating for 1 month. The delay gave the investigators time to enter the records before resistance could be organized around them. During that first month, the commission reportedly compared declared asset movements with the underlying transactions. The review identified a repeated pattern of discrepancy across 3 specific funds. The differences were not described as isolated accounting errors, but as movements that formed a consistent structure. Each of the 3 funds connected through a chain of intermediary accounts. According to the insider, those accounts eventually led back toward the individuals already under investigation. The commission now had more than delayed files and inconsistent explanations. It had a financial pathway. The discovery changed the balance of the investigation. Until that point, the network could argue that the delays reflected administrative complexity or incomplete coordination between dicasteries. The 3 funds created a pattern that could be tested against records, dates, and account movements. The cardinals had expected to confront a pope, requesting documents through the same bureaucracy they understood. Instead, they faced an outside, supported commission already working inside the system with full papal authority. By the time the structure became visible, the review had advanced far enough that stopping it would require direct interference. That decision created the next escalation. Someone connected to the alleged network moved beyond delaying records and attempted to influence one of the commission's external members. The investigation was about to cross from suspected financial misconduct into obstruction. The response from within the alleged network came quickly after the 3 funds were identified. According to the insider, someone attempted to reach one of the commission's external members, a financial auditor connected to a firm in Luxembourg. The purpose was not to challenge the evidence through formal procedure. It was to persuade the auditor to moderate the findings before they reached their final form. The approach did not disappear into a private conversation. It was documented. The record of that contact was preserved and added to the evidence already being reviewed by the Commission. That single action changed the legal character of the investigation. Until then, the central question concerned the movement of ecclesiastical assets, the accuracy of financial reporting, and the possible concealment of transactions. An attempt to influence a member of a papally authorized commission introduced a separate allegation. The case was no longer limited to suspected financial misconduct. Interference with the commission could be treated as obstruction. It suggested that someone connected to the network understood the danger of the findings and chose to pressure an investigator rather than answer the evidence. The act also created a direct connection between the suspected financial structure and an effort to disrupt papal governance. The people involved had apparently expected another internal dispute that could be slowed through hierarchy and negotiation. Instead, the documented contact gave investigators evidence of conduct taking place after the review had already begun. It was current, traceable, and tied to a commission operating under explicit papal authority. The alleged network had crossed a line it could not easily explain as administrative confusion. Delayed documents could be blamed on divided offices, and inconsistent records could be blamed on accounting failures. Pressure directed toward an external auditor was harder to disguise. It revealed movement, intention, and fear. From that point, the commission was no longer examining only what had happened to the money. It was examining what senior figures were prepared to do once the money was being followed. The obstruction allegation placed the conduct of the investigation itself inside the case. By early May of 2026, the change inside Vatican City had become visible. The insider described conversations ending when certain officials entered rooms and faces losing color after private exchanges. Corridors that had carried ordinary administrative movement became quieter as the investigation approached the men at its center. The tension was concentrated rather than public. No announcement had been made in St. Peter's Square, and no formal arrest had been confirmed. Inside the administrative structure, however, officials reportedly understood that the process had entered a new phase. On May 10th, the phones of at least 2 of the 3 cardinals were requested for forensic review. The request was transmitted through the Gendarmerie Corps of Vatican City State, the Vatican's internal security apparatus. It was not described as a violent seizure, but it carried the authority of an investigation the cardinals could no longer dismiss. The 2 men reportedly complied, though not without significant protest. They demanded clarification about the legal foundation for examining their devices and questioned the authority under which the request had been issued. Their objections did not stop the review. The legal basis came from the Pope's position inside Vatican City State. Pope Leo XIV was not acting only as the spiritual leader of the Catholic Church. He was also the sovereign of a state with its own legal institutions, investigative authorities, and judicial procedures. A properly issued papal mandate carried a force that was extremely difficult to challenge within Vatican jurisdiction. The source presents the phone request as another carefully controlled step, formally authorized rather than improvised. The investigators were not moving outside the system. They were using the system's highest authority. The cardinals had believed that political cost would restrain the Pope before the case reached their personal devices. They expected negotiation, delay, or an exit that would allow every side to preserve its standing. The forensic request showed that Pope Leo XIV had accepted the cost of confrontation. His response remained controlled. There was no public anger, no theatrical condemnation, and no speech announcing a purge. The phones were requested, the protests were recorded, and the process continued. That stillness was the quality the 3 cardinals had misunderstood. They had interpreted restraint as uncertainty and patience as weakness. By May 10th, the silence surrounding the investigation no longer protected them. It belonged to the authority closing around them. The investigation now stood at the intersection of Vatican penal law and canonical authority. The financial allegations concerned possible fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and misuse of ecclesiastical assets within Vatican City State. The obstruction allegation extended the case beyond disputed transactions because it involved possible interference with a commission established directly under papal authority. The consequences could reach far beyond resignation. If the proceedings advanced and the allegations were sustained, the three cardinals could be prohibited from holding ecclesiastical office. Removal from the College of Cardinals would require a specific act by Pope Leo XIV, placing the final institutional decision directly in his hands. The source also identifies possible detention within Vatican City or house arrest in a designated ecclesiastical residence. It does not describe automatic transfer to an Italian prison or immediate prosecution under Italian law. Such action would require a separate arrangement with Italian authorities, and the insider considered that outcome possible in theory, but unlikely within the Vatican's traditional exercise of its own jurisdiction. Every procedural distinction mattered, because the Pope was confronting men who understood the institution's legal defenses. A rushed seizure, an undocumented order, or an improvised tribunal could have allowed them to challenge the legitimacy of the investigation. Pope Leo XIV instead moved through the same framework that had once made senior Vatican officials difficult to reach. According to the insider, the Transparency Commission had been created with full legal authority. The phone examination had been requested rather than carried out through physical force, and the preliminary investigation had been opened through the proper Vatican judicial structure. Each document and authorization reduced the space in which the cardinals could argue that the Pope had acted outside his authority. That method also separated the case from a political purge. No cardinal had been condemned in advance, and the formal procedure still allowed each man to receive notification, retain canonical counsel, and submit a defense. The pressure came from the fact that the process could not simply be ignored once the tribunal delivered its notice. The insider believed formal notifications would follow within several days of the May 10th phone review. A tribunal representative would personally inform each cardinal of the allegations and the period allowed for a response. Once that occurred, institutional rumor would become a legal confrontation with written charges, fixed deadlines, and consequences that could no longer be negotiated through private influence. At least one of the three cardinals was expected to cooperate after receiving formal notice. The insider refused to identify him, but suggested that his testimony could confirm critical details about the wider network. The other two were considered less likely to accept the process without resistance. One of those men had reportedly contacted secular attorneys rather than specialists in canon law. He was exploring whether any protection existed beyond Vatican jurisdiction or whether an outside legal strategy could obstruct the proceedings. According to the insider, those discussions had produced few promising options. The three cardinals had spent months relying on the political cost of moving against them. They now faced a process designed to make that cost irrelevant to the legal outcome. The trap was not a sudden arrest in a corridor. It was a chain of properly authorized decisions that left fewer exits with every step. The case did not emerge as an isolated action during May of 2026. It followed a sequence of reforms that began soon after Pope Leo XIV took office. Each change appeared limited when viewed alone, but together they established the structure that made the current investigation possible. In June of 2025, the Pope restructured the leadership of the Vatican's financial oversight body. Several long-serving members were replaced by external appointees who were less dependent on existing internal relationships. The change altered who could inspect financial activity and who controlled the information moving upward. In August of 2025, every Vatican dicastery was directed to adopt standardized accounting procedures aligned with international nonprofit reporting standards. Offices that had previously followed separate practices were now required to present their accounts through a common framework that made inconsistencies more visible and reduced the protection created by fragmented reporting systems. In October of the same year, the Pope convened a private meeting with the leaders of the major religious orders. According to the source, he told them in direct terms that financial irregularities would no longer be handled exclusively through internal arrangements. The meeting signaled that the reform would extend beyond the central offices of Vatican City. In January of 2026, Pope Leo XIV changed the leadership of the Secretariat of State. Two individuals described as central to the old network's operations were removed from their positions. The action weakened another layer of protection before the investigation became visible to the wider Vatican community. The three cardinals had reportedly received warnings from their allies throughout this period. They were told that the Pope possessed specific information, had identified specific targets, and was not carrying out reform merely to create a public appearance of accountability. They continued to believe that tradition and political pressure would prevent him from reaching sitting members of the College of Cardinals. Their confidence also depended on the assumption that any investigation could be framed as ideological retaliation. The source explicitly rejects that interpretation. The three cardinals came from different regions, intellectual traditions, and theological positions within the Church. What connected them was not doctrine. It was their alleged participation in a financial network that required cooperation across ideological divisions. That structure made the case more dangerous because it could not be dismissed as one faction using papal power to destroy another. The insider then widened the investigation beyond the three men. The Commission's evidence allegedly pointed toward other officials who were not primary participants but had known what was happening. Some may have benefited indirectly, while others protected themselves by remaining silent when intervention was still possible. Those individuals formed what the insider called additional layers. Their exposure would depend partly on whether one of the three cardinals cooperated and confirmed the network's operation on the record. The first formal proceedings could therefore determine how deeply the Commission would continue moving through Vatican administration. When asked whether Pope Leo XIV understood the scale of what had been uncovered, the insider answered without hesitation. He claimed the Pope had known the full reach of the network since February of 2026. The uncertainty was not whether the investigation would continue, but how the Pope would control the institutional consequences once it did. Removing three sitting cardinals would send a message to every member of the College of Cardinals. It would demonstrate that papal authority was not only spiritual or symbolic, but executive and enforceable within Vatican jurisdiction. Bishops, national churches, secular governments, and Catholics around the world would watch how that authority was used. The Pope reportedly understood that every action would carry consequences beyond the men under investigation. He moved carefully because a legally justified decision could still provoke backlash, destabilize relationships, and alter the balance between the papacy and the College of Cardinals. Yet the movement did not stop. The three cardinals were no longer presented as the full case. They were the first visible layer of an investigation that had crossed financial offices, external accounts, and the highest levels of ecclesiastical authority. What happened to them would decide whether the Vatican ended the process at 3 names or allowed the evidence to lead further. Formal notifications were expected within days of the May 10th phone review. One cardinal was believed likely to cooperate, and his testimony could determine whether the investigation stopped with 3 men or moved into the wider network identified by the Commission. The case had already reached beyond Vatican City. According to the insider, Vatican authorities had confidentially notified Italian judicial officials that the matter was being handled under Vatican jurisdiction. Pope Leo XIV was not only pursuing an internal investigation, he was preventing outside authorities from taking control of it. The 3 cardinals had believed the political cost would force him to retreat. Instead, he used the Vatican's own legal structures, documented every step, and continued moving without public drama. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for the next development. The 3 cardinals may be the first layer, not the final one.